to speak, and we were delighted to discover Trevor was going to come within striking distance of Edinburgh, having travelled all the way from Cornell to sabbatical, was it, in Copenhagen?
No, just working there for the summer, not sabbatical.
Summer job. There are various people who don't need introduction. Trevor is one of them. I think we don't have a single student who hasn't started off. I think it's the first week we can say is pitch and biker. It's a point of departure, I would say, but it's a compulsory and obligatory point of passage for all of our students. And we invited him to talk. He actually offered 3 or 4 different talks. Some work dating back to that stuff on the history and philosophy of science and technical studies. More recent work on music, stuff on rating agencies and their activity, and we could have gone with all of those, but we've picked finally the Socio Materiality topic. And Trevor is bravely going to do this high tightrope walk without a safety net of a PowerPoint presentation. I think that's commendable. Well, there actually is a PowerPoint presentation, but the glass doesn't reflect it very well, so you probably won't see it. It's very good.
Oh, good, yeah, just got it up. Thank you. Thank you very much, Robin, and thanks for all coming. And it's always special. I just have to say this, because I know there's many young people here in the room who don't know the significance, well, you probably heard about it. Edinburgh Science Studies Unit, for many of us, is kind of like the ground zero for science studies, the formation of our careers, and people like scholars like Stephen Shapin, Barry Barnes, David Edge, David Bloor, Donald, who's still here, Robin came later. It's a very special place for us. I always feel when I come to Edinburgh, I'm touching ground zero, I have to do a good performance. But I have to tell you, there's some of the, I'll just tell you one story about the people from the Science Studies Unit. I remember the last talk I gave here, Barry Barnes was there. He said, Trevor, I've read your paper before, so what I'm going to do is I'm only going to come in for questions. So he went to another room, did some work, and came back in. I can tell you lots of stories about these folks. Anyway, so thanks for the invitation. So Robin wanted a talk that was general enough for this occasion. And I must say, it would have been very convenient, given our location, if I'd worked on animals. Because there's a lot of interest in STS these days in animals. I've discovered and some of you know, one of my pet hates at the moment is multi-species ethnography, but that does exist in STS. And if you find someone like Stefan Helmreich from MIT next time in Europe, he could talk beautifully in the zoo about multi-species ethnography. And my main theme at the moment, actually, I keep making points about it, is sound. And sound would have been great, actually, given the location, because we could, when I do a sound talk, we usually have loudspeakers and play some evocative sounds from the electronic music synthesizer. And having heard those baboons, I was just thinking what sort of sound I could make and how they would have responded to it. It would have been very, very interesting. It's some interesting interaction. I have got, in the talk I'm going to give, one animal example. I only just realised today there was an animal example in here. Because in the spirit of Steve Yearley, I just realised there's lots of interesting animal stuff going on at the conference. Did you notice the mints on the table? Foxes. So I'll be using lots of opportunities to make jokes about animals as well. So I'm going to talk about something very basic to our field. I'm actually going to go right back. I'll go back boringly to this bicycle example, probably. And what I'm going to talk about is something which I don't think has been settled and which there's still confusion over. And this is how humans interact with simple, mundane technologies. Things like walls, speed bumps, and as we shall see, a strip card machine. I've been working on this. I've been trying to write a book about this interaction with the material. It started with thinking about the internet. I came up to Edinburgh, gave a paper on a materialist reading of Goffman. So I'm very interested in this, trying to bring in materiality in a serious way. And each time I return to the topic, I come up with new thoughts about it. But I think it's a very difficult topic. So I don't think I've got the answers to this topic today. I'm just going to raise some of the problems as I see them. And particularly, I'm going to be talking about two concepts that deal with this interaction between the human and the non-human. The notion of a script, which comes from Bruno Latour, of course, and also a term, affordances, I'm certain you're familiar with, which comes from a different history, from Gibson and Norman, but it's a way of describing interaction between humans and non-humans, very prevalent, particularly in information science, and some people in STS have used this term as well. Now, like much in our field, I'm going to read little bits of this as well, not extemporised. Like much in our field, it was Bruno Latour who got us thinking about such things. It's that piece he wrote way back in 1992 on the sociology of a few mundane artifacts. I'm certain that's another bit of compulsory reading here, the door opener and all that stuff. Is that right? Have you read that piece? I hope so. It's a really important piece. And I think there's much more to be said than Bruno said in that piece, and I'm going to say some of it today, some confusions to be cleared up, and some things I'm dissatisfied with. But I think the genius of that early Latour piece was how Bruno took objects he encountered in his everyday life, like these doors, grooms, seatbelts, speed bumps, and so on, and made them analytically interesting. So today I thought I'd try and do something similar. So I'm going to describe my encounters, so this is about me, I'm afraid, my personal encounters with various mundane objects, and try and see what lessons we can learn. And in doing so, I'm riffing on Bruno's style in that classic piece of work. I don't want to sound aping his style, but I'm riffing on it. And you'll see some resonances. But first of all, I want to give you a little bit of the wider academic context, if you like, legitimation for the return of the sociology of mundane objects. We seem to be in the middle of what you might call a material turn. I noticed various people on their slides, they had the word materiality there. We also had the term socio materiality. Another way this is sometimes phrased is an object turn. And you can look at all sorts of fields like anthropology, archaeology, feminist theory, of course subfields like Donald's involved in the sociology of finance. They all lay stress these days upon materiality. In fact, everybody's doing it. There's one notable holdout, though, by the way, for the materiality, and that's good old North American sociology. I did a search on the American Journal of Sociology, and there's only one article published in the American Journal of Sociology, published in the year 2010, that has the word materiality either in the title or in its abstract. So mainstream sociologists are holding out against materiality. I had one graph here. Have you discovered, a colleague of mine at Connor showed me this recently, Google Ngrams? Google Ngrams are a great way of searching through all the books that Google Books are digitizing. It's incredible. You can bring down your Ngram viewer and you can search for words or groups of words and see how often they're appearing in the books that Google have scanned so far. It's a limited data source, but it's just kind of addictive. And I warn you, you can spend days on it. Because you can I did this actually last night in a hotel room just for fun. You can put in, say, Edinburgh Science Studies Unit, and you can chart the rise. It does go way up, and then it actually starts to decrease around the year. I think it was 2008, Edinburgh Science Studies. And you can plot, say, Kuhn against Merton. You see Merton peaking earlier, you see Kuhn later. And I put in materiality, and if I showed you a graph, it would go pretty level like this, and then it would exponentially increase on materiality, the word materiality. You have to be cautious of big data, as Stuart taught us today, but it really starts to go up around 1970, and then it's just going up, this exponential rise in the use of the word materiality. People in our field, by the way, also, I'm guilty of this. Andy Pickering, who used to be here, has written a piece called Living in a Material World. I've also stolen that same Madonna title in a book, actually, with Richard Swedberg. So now we get to the term socio-materiality. So what is socio-materiality? And here's an organizational scholar, some of you know, called Wanda Olakowski, and she refers to it as the constitutive entanglement of the social and material in everyday organizational life. So socio-materiality is how the social and material interact together. She calls it the constitutive entanglement. And I think that word constitutive is probably important there. She's saying it's more than just a simple fascination with things. For instance, there's a lot of research where people will talk about artifacts, boundary objects, and other material things like that, bodies. But it's this interaction with The social is important. So how human bodies, spatial arrangements, physical objects and technologies are entangled with language, interaction and practices in the doing of activities. So I think that's the key thing about socio materiality. So I'm going to give you now some examples of this. And these examples come from a special role that I played in my local community in America. And then neither of the people who visited me in my house are here, so I can lie outrageously. But Donald and Steve Elliott both visited me in my house. But it's to do with this little hamlet that I live in America. It's a place called Forest Home, just outside of Ithaca, in what's called upstate New York. Now, before I moved to Cornell University in 1990, and I didn't meet many people who'd been to Cornell, but one person I did meet who had been there and knew the place and described it very accurately was Jerry Rivetz. And Jerry told me it's this great university, Trevor, that's in the middle of nowhere. And how right he is. Where upstate says it's all. It's not New York City. You go from New York City up towards Niagara Falls, 200 miles, sort of that direction, northwest, you'll come to Ithaca. It's very rural, and we like to say it's centrally isolated. It's about 5 hours by car. There's no train, I'm afraid. There's a bus from anywhere you'd want to be, namely a major city. But somehow we manage, okay? Now, Forest Home, I do have some pictures on my computer of Forest Home. You can look it up online. It's a beautiful little hamlet. We have a river going right through it. I call it a river. It's actually, by American standards, it's very small, but it's actually by British standards. It look like a river. It's quite big. And we have these beautiful houses there on this tiny little village right near to Cornell University. And we have our own housing association, which is quaintly called the Forest Home Improvement Association. Life is good, but there's always room for improvement. So citizens, that's people who live in these houses, they all own these houses, they volunteer for this organisation. We elect a president, a vice president, and even what we call street captains. Military organisation, each street in a little hamlet has a street captain who's responsible for distributing leaflets, making certain everyone's okay, and telling them when the next party is and things like this. And I'm currently street captain, I'm proud to say. I used to be president. And some of the mundane examples I want to talk about come from my stint as president of the Forest Home Improvement Association. Now, first thing I have to stress is I didn't have a lot of power as president of the Forest Home Improvement Association. Unlike the US president, who commands Air Force One, the whole might of the US military, all I commanded was a small non-human, a gavel, like a mallet. When I was elected president of the Forest Home Improvement Association, this little wooden mallet was ceremonially passed over to me at the annual meeting with some humour. This pathetic non-human signifies the almost impossible task the president has of controlling the unruly humans at many of our meetings. Being president of my local housing association generated more email than my job as a professor at Cornell University. This is probably because most of the residents are professors. Okay, so here's the first thing. The example is called Making Visible an Invisible Wall. Now, one of the fun things that happened to me during my 2-year stint as president was that I was once mistaken for a rabbi. And this led to my first instructive example of mundane technology. So let me tell you about this interaction. I'd shown up at a meeting of a much bigger organisation than Forest Home, the Ithaca Town Planning Committee, which I was attending for only the second time. I often have to go to town planning meetings. I was asked by the town clerk, who chaired the meeting, whether I was the rabbi from Cornell University the committee was expecting. No, I was not the rabbi. But then the real rabbi appeared, and what he had to tell us I found quite extraordinary. He wanted our town to be surrounded by what he claimed was an invisible wall, a very special form of wall known in Jewish law as an eruv. It's spelled E-R-U-V, and it's a Hebrew word for mixing or blending. An eruv surrounds a space with a series of symbolic gates, as to a temple, and enables a blending of the public and the private space within. Once in existence, this invisible wall gives the space within it a special religious significance. It's a kind of form of virtual temple, and allows Orthodox Jewish religious observance to be carried out in an easier way. So if you know anything about Orthodox Jewish law, there's certain restrictions on Sabbat about technologies you can use and so on. So it would permit an Orthodox Jew, say, to take property from his or her home that would not normally be allowed on the Sabbath. The example the rabbi gave was someone in a wheelchair who could, with the help of this eruv, be permitted to leave his house on the Sabbath, while strict observance would not allow this. And she said there are many Orthodox Jews living in Ithaca who would benefit from this eruv being established, this very special form of temple wall around the town of Ithaca. So the town of Ithaca, we got down, as is I want to, considering the rabbi's request. The first problem is that building an invisible wall turns out to be a non-trivial matter. The eruv, the rabbi explained, must consist of a continuous wire around the space with columns hanging from it at certain fixed intervals which symbolize the gates to the temple. Now, an immense stroke of good fortune is, however, on the side of the modern eruv builders. Most cities and towns are already surrounded by wires and columns, telephone poles and power lines. The rabbi pointed out that with the necessary wires and poles could be cleverly adapted for the eruv purpose. There's one problem though. Jewish law stipulates the pole should be placed precisely under the wires in the right position. This position has to be determined exactly using laser measurements. Now, unfortunately, the poles in Ithaca were not quite lined up right, but an ingenious retrofitting of the wrongly positioned poles with the addition of plastic housing columns on the poles would save the day, would mean that all poles could be made to comply. Furthermore, most citizens would never be able to tell the difference between the original poles and the new eruv retrofitted poles and could pass through the eruv totally unaware of its existence. So, I don't know if you've got an eruv here in Edinburgh, but in America these things are discussed a lot. If you go online and look it up, there are eruvs around many, many American cities. And we have Jewish communities, you have eruvs all around the world. The rabbi had done his homework, anyway, before this meeting, lined up two key social groups to carry the plan forward. The two major utilities, the phone company, Verizon, and NICEC, our power company. After some initial resistance, and after being told the new poles would look identical and could be modified without any damage, these companies had agreed to cooperate. A contractor had been found, the special contractors that do this, eruv contractors, to do the necessary retrofitting, and now the town of Ithaca was being asked to sign off on the project and on formal permission to go ahead. Now, part of the job of town planning committees is to make the normally invisible infrastructure of towns visible. In other words, to make mundane artifacts a little bit less mundane. The first issue to be addressed at any such gathering is money. How much will this cost? So the town supervisor, who's responsible for the money issue in our town, clarified with the rabbi it would not cost the town of Ithaca anything, as all costs were to be borne by the Cornell Jewish community. So that was that out of the way. It wasn't going to cost us anything. But members of the committee were worried about other aspects. Wasn't there meant to be strict separation of church and state? The town clerk had diligently gone online and circulated a case of an eruv in Palo Alto which had been opposed on exactly these grounds. Now, what if a less benign religious group wanted to nail crosses to every telephone pole in Ithaca? Asked one member of the committee, who prefaced his remarks by stating that he had been brought up Jewish, and this is what I wrote down in my note. He said, to be frank, I find the whole idea of an eruv silly. But he still thought that you'd worry about other groups doing similar things, putting crosses on poles. The rabbi had his reply ready. He understood where this criticism was coming from, but the eruv demanded no precedent because it was simply allowing religious people to do what secular people did all the time, such as cavort around Ithaca in their wheelchairs. In short, it permitted something secular to happen rather than prescribing something as religious. The town lawyer then spoke. She'd researched other cases and felt that the town could maintain its discretion in the future to ban any less benign walls. But members of the planning committee still felt uncomfortable because the request came from a specific religious group with a specific religious purpose in mind. The discussion wondered over the exact wording of the request and whether other religious groups would tolerate the wall. The lawyer questioned whether the wall would break local signage ordinances. Ithaca has very strict rules, most US cities do, about signs being posted on telephone poles. And this looked like a sign. No, argued the rabbi, it wasn't a sign because it was invisible to most people. The lawyer came back. The definition of a sign is something that conveys information. Since the wall will convey information to some people, it could potentially be a sign. The committee decided further investigation was required. Someone whispered in my ear after the rabbi had left, quote, if God was really omnipotent, he wouldn't be fooled by this fake wall anyway. The last word, as always, was with God. Now, in this 10-minute discussion, the planning committee have arranged over some of the most salient issues in social materiality. The example reminds us again that technologies carry no intrinsic meanings. And this is when we go back to this old Scott approach, where we talk about interpretation and meaning rather than material agency. The meanings are always to be found amongst the social groups who interact with the technology and share a meaning of the technology. Most people share the meaning of the poles and wires as carriers as part of our technological infrastructure, namely power lines and telephone lines. Such objects are mundane, we barely notice them. Now a new meaning of the poles and wires was being asserted, but they also carried religious significance. The meaning was shared amongst a very specific social group in our town, namely Orthodox Jews. This case is interesting because the new meaning does not challenge the predominant meaning, as with more familiar cases where there's a struggle over a technology and one meaning wins out, as in that bicycle history case. In the case of the error, the two meanings of the wires and poles could coexist together, albeit with some expensive modifications to this existing infrastructure. So this points, by the way, to another important set of issues in technology studies, the mundane technologies that make up infrastructure. And as Susan Lee Starr has pointed out, and I think was pointed out today with Don's example of the optic cables, new technologies new infrastructure tend to be built along old infrastructures. Now the fascinating thing about this error case is it piggybacks upon a comparatively new infrastructure to establish a rather old meaning. It also, by the way, reaffirms the importance of new meanings of technology being created by users. The rabbi and his fellow users had imaginatively developed a new use for an old mundane technology. In the case of the error, it is important to note that although the meaning of the technology is mainly symbolic, you could say symbolic, what about materiality? Materiality is clearly involved. The wires and the pipes need to be precisely aligned. In short, you can call this religious functionality requires its own non-trivial material alignment. Measuring each pole with laser equipment and retrofitting it, if necessary, is a huge investment in time, technique and money. Furthermore, technologies and their meaning do not exist detached from the rest of society. Another obvious point to everyone here, it's institutions and culture, and the vast assemblages and technologies and humans we've already built. And this point is nicely illustrated by the planning committee's discussion. We've gone over economy, law, religion, and the nature of signifiers in this 10-minute discussion. So this is a great site, by the way, for doing research site for doing social materiality, town planning meetings where new infrastructure is discussed. Now, materiality is something that was dealt with in this Baker-Pinch example, and one of the criticisms of that sort of work in the social construction of technology is it doesn't give enough material agency to the material world. You want to give some form of agency. We'll get to that in a moment. But I do want to point out, though, that if you think about that article we wrote about bicycles, how could we have written that article about bicycles without attending to materiality? Obviously, we had to attend to things like the laws of balance, otherwise you wouldn't have anyone riding a bicycle in the first place. We had to deal with the material of rubber, air under pressure and so on. These are all material things. And we dealt with materiality as far as we needed to deal with it in that particular article. And we didn't feel any need to introduce special material agency into the argument. So now we get to other approaches which try and do this. And how do they try and do it? And is it a satisfactory way of doing it? Oh, I've got one little section here, by the way. I just want to throw this in. One last thing about the error. When I got home, I Skyped my partner who's a sociologist, and she's actually, the time I was at the town planning, she was in Israel studying the separation barrier built around the Palestinian territories. And she was really surprised to hear about this prospective error in Ithaca, and even more surprised that I'd sit there at the meeting taking notes for an academic paper or talk rather than opposing this political war which served conservative religious sentiments. Her own experience of living in a country where Jewish law dictates so many aspects of everyday life had given her a renewed dedication to the firm principle of the separation of church and state. So a new meaning of the error for my actions was about to be scripted. Talk about it that way. So there is a politics underlying my position here as well. Now you might argue this case is rather atypical because it deals with a form of what I'd call religious functionality. In other words, the ability of the error to affect people directly is a matter of whether you believe in the powers of God and what sort of God. But there are many cases discussed at forums such as planning committees where the powers ascribed to the technology at stake are straightforwardly accepted as having a direct impact on people. And I want to turn to one of these cases now. And this is clearly the most controversial issue in science and technology studies for me. How much material agency do you want to give to the non-humans? Is that the right way of talking about it even? So some people, Bruno Latour, a philosopher in the Netherlands, Peter Paul Verbeek, argue for the symmetry between humans and non-humans. In other words, for analytical purposes, the human and the non-humans are treated as equivalent. And the impetus for this sort of work is often framed as a move to go beyond the social shaping or social construction of technology by humans and to take account of the effect of agency of technology on social formations. But as I shall argue now, approaches that call for the symmetry of humans and non-humans miss the more important issue, which is to think about how and under what circumstances non-humans and their impact are made visible in the first place. So let's look at these arguments in a bit more depth with another example from my ethnography of the Forest Home Improvement Association, my adventures as president. And this is a section I call the cobbled shoulder. And this is to do with an interesting issue to do with traffic. One of the improvements we're trying to make with the Improvement Society, our little hamlet, is to deal with one of the pressing problems of modern life, traffic. After 7 years of taking data, modelling, meetings, consultations with relevant stakeholders and so on, we developed no less than a plan to calm the cars, buses and trucks on our roads. We call this grandly the Forest Home Traffic Calming Plan. And it was being considered when I was president by the town of Ilfracombe. It was my job as president to lead these negotiations over our traffic calming plan. Now, many of the standard features of the plan had much support in the community, and two of the ideas that we used, we had this idea of having special entrance features when you entered our town. It's a historic hamlet, and this would have these lampposts, and it would say Forest Home founded in 1862, and car drivers would think they were entering a beautiful old historic area, so maybe they'd slow down. That was one issue. And the other one way of pub, and another was a more standard way that a certain Professor Bruno Latour has talked about. We also introduced speed tables, which are a form of the speed bump. We call them mid-block speed tables, it's the American term for this. But I don't want to talk about those at the moment. But our community became divided over another feature of our plan. And this was known as the cobbled shoulders. Now, I received more email pro and con cobbled shoulders than anything else to do with this traffic plan. Now, the shoulder in America is the section of the road between the sidewalk, pavement over here, and the main road, okay? The idea is to keep cars away from the sidewalk and pedestrians. But then, citizens asked, where will the cyclists go? Now, our neighbourhood is full of cyclists, and many ride through on their way to work. And with a lot of talk of sustainability in the air, the bicycle on the ground has achieved a new promise in traffic planning. There's a big constraint on our tiny hamlet's narrow streets, lack of space. Our already narrow roads and crammed together houses have no room for Dutch or Danish specially designated bicycle lanes. The bicycles will have to share the road with the rest of the traffic. Yeah, it's very ugly if you're a bicycle rider. But how can you do this best in safety if you're a bicycle rider? The traffic consultants told us that the most serious bicycle accidents are caused by bicyclists leaving bicycle lanes placed on the right of roads, remember this is in America, to turn left across the path of traffic. It's actually safer, the argument goes, for bicyclists to ride in what we hope would be the newly calm traffic. So just take their place in the middle of the traffic. So how do you prevent bicyclists riding on the shoulder, which would then seem like the next best thing to a bicycle path? The answer our plan called for was to make the shoulder of a special textured material, cobbled stone, which gives the bicyclist a buzz that's sufficiently uncomfortable to force them to ride in the main road. If you get the picture, you're going to force them out of this shoulder where they actually think it's safer, onto the main road with the traffic. Now the bicyclists were unhappy. This is to assume the traffic is already sufficiently calm they can ride in safety. Supposing the cars get that fever again and speed up between the speed tables. And it could happen that most of the car drivers are students driving SUVs, and they may even get pleasure when they know that professors live in this town going a bit faster. As a bicyclist put it to me at the meeting, it sounds if you want to use bicyclists as speed bumps. They weren't too happy with that. Parents worried about children on their bicycles who will not feel confident enough to ride in traffic. The proponents of cobbled shoulders pointed out that the cobbled material itself is not a safety issue, and in emergencies, bicyclists can ride on the shoulder. They'll just be uncomfortable. Have you ever ridden on the cobbles? You can do it, just uncomfortable. So in emergencies, you can do that. So this was the technological politics in action. Our community was divided over these cobbled shoulders. Neighbours threatened to no longer talk to each other. Allegations of ill will were in the air. The poor president, I had to use all my good humour and negotiating skills to bring about compromise. Okay, and by the way, in the end, the outcome of this is that we did away with the cobble shoulder. We don't have the cobble shoulders. We have other material that shows it's different in that area, but it doesn't force the bicyclist. But I want to talk about this now in terms of material agency. Let's think of this example. Bruno has made much of law and morality being embedded in technology, such as with speed bumps, which force cars to slow down. He talks about this as a process of delegating to non-humans a form of morality formerly carried out by the humans. You can think of this as, in Chris's term, a script is embedded into these material technologies. The sign slow down, or the script slow down, is replaced by the speed bump, which does the job more reliably. And this is where I have criticism here of this. All at stake is a point known since the dawn of eternity that non-humans can directly impact humans. Try walking into a wall. The only little twist in the speed bump example is the interaction with the non-human is mediated by another non-human, the car, which the human will want to avoid getting damaged or risk an accident to. The economic incentive to save your car from expensive repair and safety, they combine together. The decision to slow down is of course made by the human, and even that decision was delegated to a machine, so a special detector on the car which notices a speed bump approaching. It will still be a human who's programmed the machine and made the decision to tell the car to slow down. Now people, I think, understand this all too well. They also understand that material technologies are getting better at getting people to slow down than symbolic ones. Thus they're suspicious of the soft arguments about the motorists attending to the signs designating the historic nature of our hamlet. Okay. Now the case of the cobbled shoulders is another case of this forcing. It's using a non-human, the textured material, which has been used to do this forcing. But this material has become visible because in this case people want to resist the forcing aspect of the technology because for them it does not obviously increase safety. Indeed, for some users it makes the roads more dangerous. So how do we think about this issue? I suggest that we think about forcing, guiding, steering and so on has been done all the time to us by non-humans and for the most part goes unnoticed. Every time you walk on the pavement, you're being guided by the non-humans which make up its physical structure. Every time you drive your car, take a bend in the road, avoid a pothole and so on, non-humans are constraining what you do. Now normally this role played by the non-humans is so taken for granted it's invisible. Think about driving your car or bicycle around a bend in the road. Perhaps you have a desire or intention to get from A to B quicker by following a straight line and ignoring the bend. What keeps you on the road is just like the speed bump, the fear of damaging your vehicle. It's exactly the same issue that we're facing all the time. I don't have to go to these fancy examples to think about this issue. Now, Bruno addresses this in terms of the issue of delegation is one we need to address. I think this talk of delegation mystifies the issue unnecessarily. Delegation of morality depends upon imputing a form of intentionality, which is, you know, sociologists always tricky to do. In Latour's analysis, the intention to get cars to slow down is delegated to the speed bumps. The example seems convincing because the intention is first spelled out in a sign, slow down, that's now being replaced by a non-human, the speed bumps. This is a particular circumstance it seems you can impute intention straightforwardly. But let's take, here's when we get to animals, let's take an example that works the other way, where a sign replaces a non-human. And if I had a slide here, I'd show you a picture of this. We have in America something called the invisible fence for constraining dogs. I think it's in other countries, I don't really have that in Scotland. It's basically an electrical wire that goes under the ground around your house, and your dog wears a special collar. As the dog approaches the wire, it gets first of all a warning audio sound, and if it gets even closer to the wire, it gets a nasty electric shock. So this is behavioural conditioning, and you can train your dog so it doesn't have to go out of your yard, and you don't need a fence anymore, you have an invisible fence. Okay? This technology is widespread throughout America. My neighbour has one of these, and his dog suddenly, the fence was down, he petted it, and but the mystery is this, that everywhere that the fence goes down, up comes a sign, okay? And the sign says, invisible fence here. And I've shown you a picture of it. You have to trust me on this. These signs are everywhere. Now, at first, I thought this was some sort of satirical thing, like beware of the dog. This is for dogs, warning them that there's an invisible fence there. It's a possibility, I suppose. But what's going on? Why are people putting up these signs where you have the non-human, now you have signification going the other way, from the non-human to the human world. What's this sign? And then you try and read the intention of the sign. And I did a little ethnographic study of this. Why is this sign there? What's the intention behind this sign? And I got different responses to people. I've got some example here. I thought some more. One of the advantages of the new invisible fence replaced the old wooden ones. It opened up my neighbour's property so my kids and his could now play unimpeded. But this introduced a new problem. His dog was now clearly visible and audible as she barked at passing strangers. What if the strangers didn't realise there was an invisible fence keeping them safe from the dog? Because the new fence is invisible to human senses, not to the dogs, of course. An old-fashioned sign might be needed, perhaps to help reassure everyone that the dog owner is being responsible and the dog is really under control and there's in fact an invisible fence there. If this is the case, it points to the important signification work which the old wooden fence did in telling people the dog was under control. But then why should my neighbour care about what strangers might think? Perhaps there's a legal or insurance stipulation which advises invisible fence owners to display a sign to prevent themselves getting sued from passers-by, suffering heart attacks at the sight of an unrestrained dog. In this case, rather than morality, it's prudence and compliance with the law which is the intent behind the sign. The more I thought about it and investigated this case, the more complex it became to infer what, if any, the intentionality of the sign was. Someone told me the sign was merely an advertisement for the Invisible Fence Company, even though the Invisible Fence Company itself proclaims at its website that the sign is to be erected solely to alert people that the dog actually is under control. That's what they recommend. It's clearly also an advertisement for this company. Another person who'd erected the sign assured me it was needed during the training phase where smaller flags marked the hidden wire. The neighbours would worry about what these smaller flags meant. In other words, it was a sign about other signs that in turn served some docking signification purpose. What if I brought in another non-human actor, as Don Harry would want me to do, the dog? Supposing my neighbour's dog was a cute little chihuahua as opposed to a snarling Rottweiler. That too would change how the sign could be read and my actions in attending to it. Now, depending on how the sign is read, different effects would follow. It could mean more revenue for the Invisible Fence Company. It could mean the difference between a heart attack or not. It could mean making a complicated risk calculation depending on the size of the dog, the state of its training, and so on. Now think about this example in terms of delegation. Is a human delegating intention first to the wooden fence, and then to the invisible fence, and then to the sign? What does it mean for a non-human to delegate to a sign, and which particular intention is being delegated? These are all things I've questioned. And even if we are to accept some kind of post-phenomenological ontology of technology, as some of our colleagues argue for, whereby humans and non-humans both do delegation, not to mention dogs and cats, we cannot escape from the problem that reading intentionality into the signs depends ultimately on humans. There is, of course, no straightforward meaning of signs, as the Ithaca Town Planning Committee reminded us. The irony is that while the Planning Committee debates whether or not an invisible fence is really a sign, I'm debating here what the sign invisible fence means. There's no escape from the contested world of human signification. Even if we buy into the notion of delegation from humans to non-humans, we run into the problem that such delegation is everywhere. The delegation intentionality argument can in principle be made every time that a purposely built non-human artifact forces a human to do something. Think of all the myriad bends the road takes. We can say the road engineers constructed that bend there intentionally and that they delegated their intention to non-human bank of the road and so on. Now maybe either the bends in the roads involve no intentionality on the part of designers because they're just following the natural terrain of an approaching hill. But there is no natural in road building. You just have to remind how Napoleon III rebuilt Paris in the 1850s at huge cost so as to maintain those straight boulevards. So in principle, every road builder could maintain these straight boulevards. In other words, a road builder who opts for a curve can be said to have intentionally avoided the straight option and delegated this intent to the bend in the road. The road itself, and it supports the car, can be caused of delegation by the road design to the road to support cars. But with this kind of thinking, delegation quickly becomes trivial because it's happening nearly everywhere, all the time. The beauty of the cobbled shoulder example is it makes visible or audible parts of the vastly normal invisible world of non-humans we live with. In this case, the human contestation makes visible what is at stake because humans do not want to accept this forcing aspect of the non-humans. Okay. I'm basically claiming here that we don't need to make this ontological turn that is argued for, and that we have to deal with materiality. We have to understand, say I've studied the electronic music synthesizer, that with a synthesizer, new sorts of material effects come into the world. So that seems to me that does happen. But what I'm trying to resist is this idea of reading too much into the materiality of these non-humans and the way they interact with the humans. So let me get to, really the problem, and another way of putting this in a nutshell is this: there are too many non-humans in the world. This is the problem we face. If you studied physics like I have, you realize that in this last second, 1 billion non-humans, neutrinos, just passed through me. So you have to have a method of which non-humans to attend to. There are too many in the world. And I don't think actor network theory in the form of the talk calendar has solved it. Here's my last example, and this is quickly, I want to deal with the other way of looking at this, affordances. And since I haven't got my PowerPoints, I'm going to make this example by getting out the bit of technology I'm going to talk about. Anyone recognise this? Clip card in Denmark, or a strip card. In the Netherlands, it's a longer one. You put it into a machine, and this is a 2-zone one on a subway station. There's a machine. It clips the side up here, and it shows you legally paid for your journey. Okay, affordances. I'm going to do this very quickly. I think we all know where this term comes from. Gibson. Norman adapted it for technologies. You can say a chair gives the affordance of sitting. But clearly, a chair has other affordances. It's using here to support my laptop. Okay, so we all know this. It's really hard to read the affordance. This is, I think, one of the mistakes made in the Gibson-Norman approach into the artifact. The artifact has to be in the context of use before you can even start to treat it in terms of an affordance. Or the key, I think, the analytical way, correct way of expressing this is that affordances are relational. People who argue that affordances are relational, I think that's the right way. If you want to use affordances, it's the right way to think about it. And obviously, you can only determine, I think, affordances for use because of the possibility of repurposing technologies so they come up with new uses. Okay, so those are some of the things I wanted to say about affordances. The other thing I'll just say about affordance as a term, I don't like it because it's not precise. It's, to use another language metaphor, it's a weasel word, affordance. Because affordance can, if someone gives you $1, right, you can afford lots of things, or you may invest that dollar and it may produce lots of things, or you may spend that dollar and it may not produce anything. So I think the economic sort of notion of affordance there gives it a sort of a feeling of not being precise enough. The other problem with affordances is that when you talk about an affordance of a chair, say it's used for sitting, it seems that involved in there is some imputation of intentionality, that someone wants to sit on the chair. There's a notion of intentionality ascribed to the actor, which the affordance is giving the human actor the capability of doing. It seems like there's an imputation of intentionality there. And one of the dangers of affordances become like a shorthand. I've used them in this way. It's a useful shorthand. If you do internet studies, you can say one of the affordances of the internet is it gives you connectivity and cutting and pasting. And that may be generally true, but it's not true in every specific circumstance that it gives you that affordance. Okay. And that shows you, I think, the problem of affordances. So here's this, the story of this clip card. You could say there's an affordance in the clip card and the card reader, which is the thing that punches it together. These two non-humans basically allow the human to make the journey on the subway. Okay. And this is what happened to me in Copenhagen. If you have to deal with this technology, I'm now very careful because I've been in Copenhagen several times. The first time I had this, I bent it in the middle and put it in my wallet. This leads to a limp strip card or a limp clip card. You don't want to have a limp clip card. Because what happens is that when you put it into the machine, it won't register it, even though you prepaid for your journey with this. You buy this clip card, I should say, you buy for this in advance, okay? You pay 160 Danish kroners for this clip card. So this is a true story of my last one of ethnographic investigation of routine technology. I was at Norrport Station, and this is not my most recent trip in Copenhagen, this was at the 4S meeting. And I'd had my clip card. I had just enough journeys left to get to the airport and that beautiful new metro that heading in Copenhagen. I arrived at Norrport. I wanted to take the elevator down because I had a heavy case. There was a woman in the elevator struggling with her pram, and naturally I went and helped her into the elevator, and we went down together. I came to put in my clip card into the machine, and it would not work. I was pushing. Christ, I really want to use this clip card. The woman came up to me, realised what was happening, and smilingly told me exactly what to do. Does anyone know what to do if this ever happens to you? Just a useful thing. You spit on the clip card. And trust me, it worked. It was incredible. She just said, this is what you do. She made that, and I did it, and put it in, and it worked. Now, it's a very useful thing. If you learn anything this later, that's one useful thing in that situation. So, here, basically a new bit of materiality is introduced. Now what's going on is essentially, she is repairing, I see it as an issue of repair, she's repairing the affordance of the strip card that's been lost by my mishandling it. Okay, I haven't followed, you want to talk about the Tor's terms, I haven't handled the script in the right manner, I've broken it down. She's doing important repair work and helping me. Okay. But if we look at this accomplishment here of this repair, it's a very complicated situation. It introduces another material, if you like, object, spit, and also the conditions of me discovering this and being able to, in other words, being able to complete my journey, if you want to talk about it, the social setting that this occurred in is a very complicated one, because this is a piece of tacit knowledge that presumably some people on the transport system in Copenhagen, not everybody, I've done ethnographic, I've been at parties and asked how many people know about this, and not everyone in Copenhagen knows about it, a few people know about it. And I elicited this information from her because of my previous entanglement with her, with the pram, which of course is another material artifact, in the elevator, which is another material artifact. And then she'd imparted to me this piece of tacit knowledge about the card, which enabled me to use it, and if you want, in the term of affordance, restore or repair the affordance to the strip card. So when one uses the term affordance and one's trying to read it off, one has to think of all this complicated social situation that we've been through to understand fully what an affordance means. Okay, so my argument is briefly that if you want to use this term affordance, you have to look at the wider social settings in which affordances are made available, if you want to use the ethnomethodological way of talking about it. How we accomplish, if you like, accomplishing social life. Look at the details of that social situation. And because affordances tend to take us away from that, I don't think that's a productive direction to go. So those are my two critiques of scripts, or delegate, which involves delegation, the scripting notion and the affordance notion. And I want you to come back at me and tell me why I'm wrong. And because there's certainly a lot of use of this vocabulary at the moment. It's clear that if we're going to be dealing with materiality, how humans are interacting with this materiality in science is a crucial issue for us. So we need to try and get this clear and straightforward. So I thought it'd be a good provocative thing before dinner to throw it out. Thank you.